Hello, everybody. It's April 18th, 2025. And I think it's been a couple weeks at least since I did my last diary episode. I'll find that out once I go to my page. But I got back from ESL Raleigh about 6 days ago, 5 to 4 days ago, actually. And getting really in the habit of settling back in after events. But this week I had some thoughts, and I'll just get right into the thoughts. So I've talked about living in extremes where people tend to be one extreme or the other whenever they're having a tough time with something, or whenever something's like a sensitive spot for them, or just honestly ignorance or something along those lines. You get in a lot of trouble when you think in extremes. And what I realized recently, more so, was that when I was just trying to establish good habits, you'll see how the habits tie back, I promise. When I was trying to establish good habits, that there were certain things in my life that I was kind of being too laissez-faire about. I was trying to give myself too much space for decisions, to a point where basically I had willpower fatigue, decision fatigue at the end of the day. And it was actually making me unhealthier, whether it's like mental, physical, whatever. It was actually making me unhealthier than when I had like the unhealthy habit that was normal. Like, meaning when I say normal, I mean like that was what I did consistently. So say you have like a 50 out of 100 is like where you want to land, right? If my old habit was like a 40 out of 100, so it wasn't quite up to snuff, but it was not that bad. By having too much of a decision, I was sometimes operating at like an 80, but other times operating at like a 10, and the 10s were more often than the 80, so then I ended up at like a 35 anyway. Because the ideal that I was going for was like too high, basically, the 80. And also I was making it so like, oh, if I'm going to eat something healthier every day, rather than it's going to be at 7 a.m. or it's good, I don't wake up at 7. It's going to be at 8:30 a.m. that I'm going to eat this thing. Rather than doing that, I was kind of like, well, I want to eat this 4 days a week, and every morning I'll just kind of decide if I feel like eating it. That was like, for lack of a better description, kind of what I was doing. And I think it's fine if you do something 4 days a week as opposed to 7 days a week. But what I've realized is that if I don't say it's going to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, whatever, if I don't say that, then I'm effectively leaving myself with the decision every day. And for the short term, that would work, is what I noticed. For the short term, I would have like really good habits. I would also feel like I had a really good routine, I guess. I don't want to call them habits, because habit means you don't think about it anymore. And I also was just kind of doing everything I set out to do. But then I feel like when you do that, what happens is 1 week where you're under a lot of stress or you're mentally distracted, suddenly you like find yourself derailing really hard. Where like one day you decide not to do it, and you're like, I'll do it tomorrow. It's fine. I have 4 days out of the week. And then like the next day you don't do it, and then you have like 4 days left in the week and you haven't done it any times. And then you're like, oh, God, now I have to do it 4 days in a row. And this is like something that really takes a lot of effort for me. So I don't know how well I'm describing this to all of you. I know I'll understand it. But the idea is that my habits and my way of implementing them was giving me a lot of decision fatigue when I was trying to prioritize freedom, I guess you could say. Choice of what I did with my time. And what I realized about extremes, this is like tying it all the way back to what I mentioned at the start of this video, was that it kind of hit me. Maybe it seems kind of obvious, and I think I always kind of understood it, but it hit me that the reason that people operate in extremes is because the extreme is effectively not making a decision. It's just like, if I'm offered these two choices, I'll always take this one. Politics in a nutshell, right? Because one idea, if I operate in extremes and say I'm always voting this way or voting that way, or I'm always going to choose that over that, it can be politics, it can be anything. Anytime I have a choice between healthy food and unhealthy food, I'll take the unhealthy food. You know, like, um, my point being is that it's the brain doing what it does best, which is creating habits and being lazy. And the idea of your brain being lazy is that it leaves room, operating power for your brain to do what it would rather be doing, or what you think is more important, or whatever you're telling it to do, basically. And it just kind of hit me like that people operate in extremes because they're lazy, for the same reason that we run out of power fatigue. And I don't even want to chop up laziness as like a horrible vice or some shit like this. The fact is that we only have so much brain power, we only have so much energy in the day. And what I'm realizing is that operating in extremes is effectively just a really, what probably started as a small bad habit, left unchecked. It's like an unfettered bad habit is operating in extremes. If I think to myself that like 100 is always eating unhealthily and a 0 is eating always healthily, and say you want to like land at like a 30, you know, say you want to land at a 30 because that gives you some enjoyment in life because you're eating stuff you really like eating, and it also gives you not too much unhealthy food, right? So you're operating closer to the 0 than you are the 100. The point that I'm trying to make is if your habit is a 31, what I feel like ends up happening over time is unless you check in, unless you kind of ask yourself how you're doing, it's easier for you to make excuses or compromises in the direction of eating unhealthily because that's what your habit's kind of telling you to do. And if you leave it unchecked, you'll eventually end up at 100, eventually. And that means you just never check in with yourself saying, I feel like crap, or I've eaten a lot lately, or I haven't been working out, or you know what I mean? I feel like that's where a lot of extremes happen. People who are extremely unhealthy in some capacity, like I said, mental, physical, whatever, emotional. It's kind of like, you know, you don't generally start, like, people in my chat sometimes talk about like suppressing emotions and stuff, and it's like you don't just one day start suppressing all of your emotions. It's like one experience in your life causes you to suppress one emotion or to suppress your emotion in that given moment, and then over time, if you do that a million times or whatever, 100 times, 1,000 times, you know, suddenly you go from a slightly bad habit to not knowing how to express your emotions or handle your own emotions, you know. So I think this is a very broad spectrum. And it just kind of hit me. It just kind of hit me that that's why people operate in extremes. And I thought that was kind of cool. That's just where my brain was going this week. And I realized that what I basically need to do is ask myself, okay, arbitrary scale, 0 to 100 on this subject, where do I want to be? And in an ideal world, like this middle point, this like focal point that I'm going for is what I believe is like I have my preferences, I have my way of doing things, but I'm like open-minded, and I've thought about both sides clearly, you know, whatever it's talking about. I've thought about many different approaches. Not everything's like black and white. But that's the whole idea, is like the middle area means that not everything's black and white. If you were to be purely black, you'd be on this side, purely white. Okay, that sounds really bad, actually, but you get what I'm saying. The idea is that if I always go one direction and never the other, I will end up at that extreme, and that does make something black or white. And if I, you know, kind of know when to do one or the other, I'll end up somewhere in the middle. Well, yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to say is I've realized that I need to think about where I want to be on that scale and where I think my habits that influence that scale, because not every scale is like a single habit, right? It can be influenced by multiple different things. And I have to think about where do my habits direct me to on that scale. And also sometimes knowing that maybe I can't be perfect. And even if I want to go for a perfect 50, that I could maybe rather settle on a 60, if it's a consistent 60, meaning like I know how to keep it in check. I'm going to monitor it every now and then, you know, check in, rather than striving for that perfect 50, because maybe that perfect 50 is like overshooting it and it'll end up backfiring the other way. As you may have well been able to tell by now, maybe you disagree, but I don't feel like this is a well-articulated thought. I mean, I haven't really said it out loud until this video, but that was part of why I do these videos, is because it just allows me to kind of word vomit for my own sake. But yeah, I guess being keenly aware of where I want to be on that scale and where I am on that, or where my habits what habits I have and where they're landing me on that scale. That's kind of like the huge takeaways I've had from this pondering, philosophical inner monologue. And also kind of has to do with like judging other people's habits and perspectives. And it kind of made me more empathetic. And I mean, it did make me more empathetic to people who are on one extreme or the other when it comes to certain things. In reality, it's just them having a small little thing that never got checked, and here they are. It's like, you don't become clinically insane overnight, right? You are slightly insane, and then over time it gets worse and worse, and then one day you wake up and maybe other people think you're just completely fucking bonkers. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that when I feel like I see somebody who's operating at some ridiculous extreme, when I observe it, I guess it just gives me more sympathy for the fact that sometimes life makes it tough to check in. Sometimes our circumstances make it tough to check in. Self-awareness is really hard to come by, and it's also very exhausting. And some people's brains, like, they always say, like, it's people kind of form their own realities, and when they are faced with a reality that contradicts their like one they formed in their brain so starkly that they just can't take it, and they'll basically ignore facts. That's like something people do. I mean, I don't have else to say other than that's something people do because they've crafted this reality, and it's almost like if your brain could think at like a level of a 10 and you're using it at a 0 and somebody's asking you to operate at a 6, it's like you can't just go from a 0 to a 6. Your brain's going to fucking, you have to like work your way up. And I feel like one thing that I thought about is that like I had a viewer who like mentioned agreeableness as a personality trait, and I was like, I don't think it is, but then I've never really thought about it. And that was like a subject where I remember the viewer being so surprised that like I thought about this so much. He's like, oh, you like, I came back like a week later talking about it. He's like, wow, you really thought about this. And it's like, one thing I give myself credit for is that I'll admit and recognize when I have not spent time thinking about something. And if somebody says something and I haven't thought about it before, I'm just like, oh, I should think about that. Depends. Like some things I'm like, that's not worth my time. But sometimes it like gets brought to my attention and I'm like, wow, yeah, that definitely seems like something worth thinking about. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that I feel like when you think about it as small habits that lead you astray, but also it means that small habits are things that can kind of lead you to where you want to go. And sometimes that gap from 100 to 50 seems insurmountable, right? But when you think about it in the way of trickling your way there, as if you tweak a small habit rather than slowly growing away from that equilibrium over time, you'll slowly work your way towards it. I feel like that just makes things much more digestible. It makes me more empathetic towards people that find themselves in their situation. And it also finds me more hopeful for myself and for others. And I guess to myself reminds me like it's never too late. It's never like no problem is unsalvageable for the most part. But yeah, that was just where my brain went this week. So decision fatigue, willpower fatigue, and how it pertains to people operating in extremes, and how I myself, if left unchecked, sometimes will find myself operating in certain extremes. I think there's millions of extremes you could operate in. We all have our things, and realizing that this is kind of a symptom of our brain wanting to be lazy, creating habits. So every time I find myself in extremes, I feel like this week it became clear to me that, okay, what are my habits that I think got me here, or at least contributing to this? What's like one habit that I can look to change? And rather than like viewing this problem as such a big deal, it's just like, that's a problem worth addressing. I think this is the habit that's causing it. Let's try to rewire that one a little bit. And that just feels like a very cookie cutter A to B goal here. The journey is the part you got to kind of enjoy because it's going to be a lot of trial and error. You can't just say, like, this is the bad habit, I'm going to replace it with this good one and it's going to work. I've also realized that failures are simply learning another way not to do the right thing. And that's all they are. And that's one step closer towards finding what works for you. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching. That's it for this week's episode. I'll see you guys next week.